Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Rational Female Podcast. And we've got a great guest today, David Shackleton. So he is a published author of this very wonderful new book. It is called, as you can see, it is called Matrisensus, Masculine Collapse and Feminine Shadow. And he basically discusses the concept of matrisensus, which is a term that he himself coined, and talks about gender politics and the dynamics between masculinity and femininity, which is what we're all about on this channel. So please, David, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about yourself and your background?
All right. So my background, I was trained as a scientist. And so that's kind of the attitude that I bring to the book, is about research and problem solving in the area of social science. And I worked as an engineer for a long time, and then I became interested in the culture. And I became interested because it seemed to me like the story didn't match the reality. For instance, my first wife left me in 1987, saying that she was afraid I would be violent. And I haven't been violent in my adult life. And so I looked at that and I thought, she's seeing something from the culture, not me. And I looked at the culture, I guess, for the first time, seriously. And I saw that it was a story about violent men and victimized women. And I thought, that's not the whole story, because in my own family, my mother was powerful and very shaming. She wasn't physically violent, but she was emotionally violent. And so, the power balance was completely different in my own personal life. And so I thought, this is not a complete story. And I got interested like a scientist. And so from that time, basically 40 years ago, I have been applying, I guess, research skills to the area of society and culture, and trying to figure out what's really going on, the mechanism underneath the narrative, the story underneath the story, as it were. What's the truth? What's really happening? And this book is the result of that exploration. It's my reporting back after 40 years of study and thinking about it.
Okay, excellent. So I've just posted the link to your book in the chat. This is the Amazon purchase link. So why don't you tell us about the term matrisensus? It's the title of your book. Why don't you tell us what it means?
Yeah, so I noticed that we don't have a name for the feminine collective shadow. Shadow used in the Jungian way to mean pathology. We have a name for when the masculine system goes wrong. That's patriarchy. And so, the masculine system, historically or traditionally, men were responsible for society, for external society, and for specifically for government. And what they evolved was a hierarchical system, which was about service and service to the community. And when that stops being about service and individuals become more interested in their personal power, their personal privilege, their personal status, and so on, then we can call that patriarchy. So we have a name for when the masculine social hierarchy goes wrong. And it's patriarchy because the patri stands for masculine, like patriarch, and the archy is short for hierarchy. So I coined a word which is constructed the same way to name the feminine shadow. Now, the feminine is different because women don't organize hierarchically, typically. They organize as a consensus. And what we are looking at is a social consensus. And so I gave it the name Matrisensus, where matri stands for feminine and census is short for consensus. And so what I'm talking about is the social consensus that says how you should think about things. You know, what's right think and what's wrong. And right think, you know, we're familiar with that, is that women have been oppressed for centuries, and now it's their time to be restored and to be empowered, and that men are being perpetrators and so on. That is the story. And it's a story that is enforced by the social consensus. If you don't go along with that consensus, then there are various kinds of things that can be done to you. You are stigmatized. You can, you know, there can be social sanctions. There can be legal sanctions. You can be accused of things. And so we see that social consensus is very powerful. We saw that in Me Too, for instance, when a lot of mainly men's lives and careers were just destroyed by nothing more than accusation, than simple social sanctions. And so it's a very powerful consensus, and it certainly has a pathological side. And so that's why I came up with the name Matrisensus, to try to describe it and to show that, hey, there's equality here. Women and men both have a light and a dark side, and we need to be able to talk about women's dark side just the same as we can talk about men's dark side. Otherwise, we're not dealing on an equal playing field.
Okay, so from what I understand, the idea of matrisensus is basically the collective feminine shadow. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
As an antithesis to the
So
feminist.
when the feminine shadow is projected at society level, it becomes the dominant culture in society, then we can call it matrisensus.
Okay, so where do you think the idea that feminists use of women being historically oppressed comes from? Where do you think this idea actually came from, and how do you think it became so pervasive in our culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it comes out of an authentic feeling of oppression. I think that feminists were basically sincere in their story, but mistaken in their analysis. I mean, the fact is that life itself is oppressive to everybody. Reality itself makes constraints. You know, you have to perform at a high level in order to succeed. And if you go back 100 or 150 or 200 years when feminists were forming their ideas, life was just really hard for everybody. And you know, there was a lot of disease, there was a lot of death, a lot of children died in childhood. There was a lot of poverty, there was a lot of injustice, and so the idea that women were oppressed is a natural idea. Where it was mistaken was they looked at men and they said, hey, they've got all the power that we lack. They've got all the privilege that we have. Their lives are easy. Well, you know, that's just basically grass is greener phenomenon. There was no real empathy for the fact that men's lives were just as bad as women's, but in different ways. And so that's where I think the idea came from. It's a kind of a natural idea. The interesting question, the question that animated me when I started looking at this was, how come that idea became so powerful? How come it got so much traction? What explains the psychological power that it's so hard to argue against, and the coherence of that idea? The coherence means that it's a very complex pattern of ideas that are where millions of people are all marching in lockstep. They're all believing and saying the same things. How come they all feel the same way about this particular issue? That's the question that engaged me.
And what do you think the reason for that is? Why do you think this suddenly caught on and became such a huge thing?
Yeah, that's the key. That's the key question. And that's the question that the book sets out to answer. And in order to answer it, we have to understand the concept of an archetype. And it's not a common concept in society. Most people don't know much about archetypes. And that's because we don't know much about social psychology. What we know about, when we think about psychology, what we know about is individual psychology. And individual psychology is the psychology of experience. It's the psychology of childhood experience especially. So it's the psychology of how we're shaped by what we find after we're born. Social psychology is not that. It's got nothing to do with that. Social psychology is the psychology we inherit. It's the psychology we're born with. It's the patterns of thinking that guide us, all of us the same, because we all inherit it from our ancestors. And so let's use an example. Human children, human infants, they all learn language. Why do they learn language? It's such a huge task. It takes so much effort. When you think about learning a language, it's a massive intellectual accomplishment. And infants do it at like 1 year old. Well, it's because they're programmed by their psychology. They arrive programmed to pay attention to the sounds. They have in their brains, a part of their brain, all of us do, that is pre-constructed by evolution. It's put there over millions of years because it works, because it gave us an advantage. And so children get this part of their brain which is looking for words. It's got a huge area to populate with words, and any words will do. A child can learn any language. It doesn't come with any words. What it comes with is the inclination to study what goes on around it, to listen to the sounds, to try to imitate them. So an archetype is two things. It's a pattern of intellectual structure in the brain, which is ready to absorb. And secondly, it's a motivation. It provides a motivation to want to do this thing. Infants want to listen to the sounds around them and to try to make sense of them. Why do they try to do that? Well, because they're programmed that way, because they have a part of their brain. So that brain function is called an archetype. That's what an archetype is. It's a pre-programmed part of the brain which has a particular function. It's an organ of the brain, just like an organ in the body, like a heart or the lungs. They're constructed with a particular function that we need to live well. So archetypes are brain organs with particular functions. And so two areas that have been really important to us historically have been families and society, because we are born in families, we grow up in families, and then we move into society and we have to function in the wider society. And so with thousands and thousands of years of people living in families and living in society, we have been shaped. There have been parts of the brain that we can call the family archetype and the society archetype that have been shaped to tell us how to behave in these environments. And so the family archetype is a set of rules about how to be in family that has been shaped by evolution. That the people that had these ideas about how to be in those situations survived better than those that didn't. And so just like evolution shaped bodies, it also shaped our minds. And so here's the basic idea is that in the 1960s, the masculine competence hierarchy, the masculine governance structure, for various reasons that I go into in detail, collapsed. It didn't collapse in a visible way. It was a psychological collapse. It lost confidence in itself. If we look at it in the 60s, the men the establishment was men in their 60s. And they had experienced 2 world wars, the Holocaust, the atom bomb, the Great Depression, terrible experiences in the first half of the 20th century. And then the civil rights movement came up and started attacking the masculine establishment and saying that it was oppressive and that it was dysfunctional.
Sorry, when you say civil rights movement, sorry to cut you, do you mean the African American civil rights movement or the feminist movement?
I mean all of it. I mean the feminist movement. Okay. I mean the civil rights movement, like Martin Luther King, and the racial civil rights movement. All of it came up, and there was an acknowledgement that the grievances were real.
Yeah.
And that was a very healthy thing. But unfortunately, the attack did not cease. And so there was a collapse of confidence, of credibility for the masculine governance system. And what replaced it, what women brought to the situation when they stepped forward and said, "Hey, we can do better than these oppressive men who've made such a mess of things. We can do better." What they brought was the family way of being, because that was their experience for thousands of years, how to be in a family, and how to make that work. And so they brought family values, which are families are about protecting the innocent, protecting the vulnerable. They're about fairness within the family, and they're exclusive. They're about us and them, because you're either in a family or you're not, and the people who are not part of the protection scheme. You don't have to look after them. You don't have to provide resources for your neighbor's children, only for yours. And so there's a polarization built into the family archetype. And so when that is applied at the scale of society, that value system, then it overlooks all of the society, all of the things that make society work well, which are the idea of exchange. When you, in order to have a job, you have to give something to your employer that they value in order for them to give you something that you value, which is your salary. There's an adult exchange based on an agreement. That's not how family works. In a family, you're there by entitlement, by belonging, not by agreement. And so, and you're not expected to contribute. Like the Communist Manifesto expresses how to be in a family, to each according to their needs, from each according to their abilities. It's not about balanced exchange. It's about entitlement and belonging. Okay, and so the family archetype, when it's applied at the scale of society, becomes dysfunctional. And that's what I call matrisensus.
That's very
what it is. When the family archetype is applied at the scale of society, it is a matrisensus. It's a feminine idea about how to run society, and it's a social consensus which is coerced, which there are penalties for not going along with. We can call it political correctness, if you like. And so that's how it becomes dysfunctional, because it's the wrong system, or the family archetype applied in the wrong place, applied at the level of society, where it becomes dysfunctional. And what we're seeing is the result of that. If you look at all of the polarization, all of the political polarization, for instance, all of the us and them, it's all because it's family archetype. Now, this is a new idea. People up until now have been saying, well, it's tribalism or something like that. But that's not what's going on. What's going on is it's the family archetype applied in the wrong place.
Well, that kind of answers what I was going to ask, which was about, can you talk a lot about archetypes and Jungian psychology in the book? And I wanted to ask,
Yeah.
how exactly does this relate to feminism as a political ideology? But I kind of feel like you've already answered that. Do you think you'd like to expand a bit more on that, or?
Well, let me say a little more.
Yeah, go on. Go for it.
One of the James Hillman is a Jungian psychologist, and he said an archetype is best comparable with a god. And what he's talking about is the compulsive nature of archetypes. Archetypes are the human operating system. They're the structure in our brains which tells us how to be in basically every situation. They're the part of our psychology that we inherit. And because we inherit it, it doesn't feel like ours. It basically runs us. And so archetypes are very compulsive. And so go back to that analogy I made of the child learning language.
Yes.
They don't do that because they wake up one morning and think, hey, that sounds interesting. Those noises around me, I think I'll pay attention. No, they're compelled to do it. They're compelled by their psychology, by the psychology they have inherited. Every child does it. This is not a whim. This is a compulsion. Okay? And so we have to recognize the power of these archetypes. They influence us from behind the scenes, from outside of our awareness, so that we don't recognize that we're running a script, that we're running a program. And so that's the nature of the power. So, you know, an ideology is not like that. We can pick up an ideology and we can be reasoned out of it, but we can't be reasoned out of an archetype. Because an archetype operates us through what feels right. I don't mean emotions. I don't mean anger or fear or joy. I mean what feels right. Like, you know, when you say, oh, I'm trying to remember that person's name. And I say, oh, was it Jim? And you say, no. And you say, was it Fred? Say, no. Was it David? Ah, that's it. What tells you that that's the right thing? It just feels right. It's a recognition, right? It's an alignment with something that's already in you. That's what drives archetypes. They feel right at that level. They feel utterly true, as if there's no way they could possibly be wrong. That's the power of an archetype. And it feels that way without our ever being aware that that's going on, that level of influence is operating in our minds to kind of coerce us along a path. So that's why James Hillman said an archetype is like a god.
Yeah, that's an interesting analogy. I mean, yeah, because obviously humans, you know, as you said, with the children learning language, we learn through pattern recognition, and it's through recognizing certain patterns that we come to draw conclusions and observations about the world. So, yeah, I mean, you know, feminism, it definitely used human psychology, and I suppose you could say, which no doubt you discuss as well in the book, about how there seems to be this inherent empathy towards women. And I've talked about this in some of my videos about toxic femininity. So there's, you know, the archetype of women as being innocent and virtuous, which is also very much tied to Christianity, and the idea of the woman as innocent, woman as virtuous, and men as the kind of the villain. Because you said earlier, you know, how you were framed as the villain in your marriage to your first wife, and that is quite, there's something disturbing about this, because it kind of undermines the negative aspects of womanhood, but also genuine bad behavior in women. But it just frames everything as a gender paradigm, rather than there are some decent people, like this is good behavior, this is bad behavior, etc., etc.
Yes. And that's, you know, that's what I'm saying. What we've substituted because of Matrisensus, what Matrisensus has substituted is identity in the place of behavior. And so now what feels right is that women are innocent and vulnerable by identity, not by behavior, but by identity. And men are guilty and responsible by identity. And you know, and we can make sort of little adjustments to that by, you know, when we have our own children, or we have a husband or a wife, and we can see their dark side or their light side as well. But the general pattern is still in place in our minds. I characterize it this way in the book. I say that feminism is basically compassion without accountability for women, and accountability without compassion for men. And so it's polarizing. It polarizes compassion and accountability. Healthy relationships have compassion and accountability for both parties. But when you polarize it on, you know, one side by identity, then it becomes very dysfunctional. And we're seeing the results of that dysfunction, of course, in society, and in the increasing polarization around identity. It even shows up in politics, right? Between left and right, the polarization. So the insight from the book is that this polarization is a result of the family archetype being applied, because families have been polarizing for thousands of years. And that's been functional in the history of the family. It was very functional because it meant that every child had parents who were devoted to its welfare, to the exclusion of everything else. And that was very functional for the survival of families. The fact that the fact that it was totally irrational, that there was no like rational reason to prefer your children over your neighbor's children. There was nothing rationally to distinguish them. It wasn't that your children were much more deserving of care and your neighbor's children weren't. No, it was a bias built in, and it was a bias that was built in for good reasons, because it meant that at that local level within the family, it was the best for those children to survive, to have parents who valued them, up to life itself. But when you apply that partiality, that bias at the level of society, then it's no longer functional, becomes very dysfunctional. And that's what we're looking at.
Cool, interesting. Yeah. So just gonna take a short pause and look at the chat. So somebody said all living things communicate, just depends on what they have to communicate with. Some people are unable to speak, hear or see, and rely on their touch to communicate. So this is tied to what we were saying earlier, what you were saying earlier about, language and communication. And then they also said, is this the same as behavior? Children mimicking their older siblings and parents, and then society. So in psychology, that's known as social learning theory. I remember that from A-level psychology. And, it's kind of tied to what we're saying about pattern recognition and how we learn. And, I do, because I definitely think a lot of our behavior, and I'm sure you kind of get into this too, is biological and genetic. I think a lot of our behavior is based on DNA. I don't believe that we're all a blank slate, that everything is learned. I think that there's some things that are part of, human, like innate humanity, and then some things that we learn. And I think that now it seems to be this idea that everything is learned, and that's where people now say, be a woman is performative, masculinity is performative. It's not true. There are certain things that are ingrained in us, like the desire to care for your own children. So yeah, that's just, yeah, it's a kind of a nature nurture debate that's so pervasive within psychology. I'm very much for it's a bit of both argument.
Well, I've been arguing for the nature. That's the story I've been telling for the last, half an hour. Is that, and certainly there is also nurture, and I mentioned at the beginning that individual psychology is about nurture. It's about experience. And social psychology is about nature. It's about inheritance. And obviously we are shaped by both. But if you want to look at the large patterns of human beings, then they're not going to be about experience, because the experience of different individuals varies. Different families, different nations, different cultures, different experiences. And so if you want to look at social psychology, then you need to look at inheritance. You need to look at social inheritance, and particularly psychological inheritance. What psychology have we inherited from our ancestors? And that's where archetypes come in.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So to move on slightly, you talk about Lloyd Demars in your book, and I've heard the name of this person before. Can you tell me a bit about Demars's work in, studying, studying children and how it influenced you?
Yeah, that was an interesting discovery that I made some years ago. Lloyd Demars was a social historian in New York. He lived in New York. He died recently. And he wrote a number of books, but the key one, I think, was his book, The History of Childhood. And what he did was he went to primary sources and looked at things like diaries, individual correspondence, newspaper articles, medical reports, lawsuits, all that kind of historical record. And he was interested in childhood because basically we've looked mainly at adults historically, and nobody had really looked at the lives of children. And what he discovered was that there was an advance in the way that children were treated from a couple of or 3,000 years ago up to the present. And the advance was an advance of empathy, an advance of caring for the child as a child and empathizing with the child. And so he developed a theory, which is a psychogenic theory, which means it's the psychology, the psychological pattern in influencing the formation of children. And in particular, the psychological pattern of the mother, because the mother was historically the primary child raiser. And what he found, or what he theorized, was that the mothers that cared for their children, that loved their children, more than they were loved when they were children, made a difference. They made a difference that lasted. Because most people simply repeat when they are parents, they repeat the way that they were treated as children with their children. They treat them the same as they were treated. And so nothing really changes. But those few parents, mainly mothers, who made a difference by treating their children better, by working on themselves as individuals, so that they worked through some of their issues and didn't need to project them onto their children, so they could treat them better. They made a difference, because from then on, in the downstream of that, generationally, all of the people carried that forward because they would do the same as they were treated. And so they moved the baselines. And so over a couple of thousand years, he was able to trace the advance of empathy due to pioneering mothers. Now, this was not well recognized within the scientific community as the groundbreaking idea that it was. And so my contribution in the book is to pair this up with men's great contribution historically, which is the generation of knowledge. And so in just the same way that a few mothers extended themselves to be better mothers than their own mothers had been, a few men extended themselves and did things like scientific research. They were scientists, or they were inventors, or they were explorers, or they were philosophers, and they applied themselves to the generation of new knowledge. And over, again, hundreds or thousands of years, we are the beneficiaries of that advance of knowledge that was collected. Each time a new discovery was made, it entered the culture, and it was kept, and we built on it. And so over, let's say, a couple of thousand years, men have gifted us incrementally advances in knowledge. Not all men, just a few men. And in the same way, women have gifted us incrementally advances in empathy. And advances in empathy have resulted in our modern notion of human rights, of multiculturalism, of basically caring for each other much more than we did in the past. So this is a great gift, and it's women's gift to humanity. It's their own merited contribution, fully merited. It's not something, it's not like feminists' grievance about how women were excluded from science and technology. This is women's gift, and it's just as big and just as important. And so hand in hand, men have given us knowledge, women have given us empathy, and together we have shaped the world we see today. And so I think this is a wonderful message. It says to women, you don't need to feel like you were excluded from the great historical drama. Women were there, front and center, just like men. We weren't, just like many of the men who gave us knowledge were not recorded, but certainly more of the men, like we know most of the significant scientists. We don't know the names of most of the significant mothers in history.
Yes.
And that's the big difference. But, like not knowing their names is not as important as recognizing the contribution. The contribution is real. And so women can stand alongside men as equal contributors to our society and to our heritage. So that's what Demoz was, the pioneering researcher that discovered that. It's been confirmed experimentally now. His theory has been experimentally confirmed scientifically. But what I've done in the book is lay it out in the way that I've just described as a story about men and women's contribution to the world.
No, I think that's so beautifully said, honestly. And this is exactly why I call myself an anti-feminist women's advocate. So, I think the feminist narrative of saying women have always been collectively oppressed is just ludicrous. And, it really undermines women's contributions. And it's so good to hear you say that women did contribute through empathy and motherhood. And in ancient societies, for example, why did they worship goddesses? Why was the idea of the mother goddess held up in such high reverence? The idea of the divine mother, this was such a big thing. So, I think it shows very seriously, or even, the Virgin Mary and Christianity, like the idea of people looking at a woman and thinking, oh, this is someone who's divine, this is someone who can bear life, like that is so important. And all those men who did embark on the discovery of knowledge, the Einsteins and the Plato, or not Plato's, but the other, yeah, I guess Plato's, but John Locke, these men, they were raised by a woman. They had a woman, and they wouldn't have been able to exist if a woman hadn't given birth to them. So, yeah, I think it's such an important thing to say. So I would like to ask, so the idea of men doing what they do for women to get love and status, affection. Do you think that this is the matrisensus at play, or do you think this is something else entirely?
Oh, I think that's a different thing. The relationship between men and women, sort of the private, intimate relationship between men and women, is very different than Matrisensus.
Well, what I mean is, like, so then what do you think is the kind of the motivation for men to kind of do what they do in society in terms of to, have relations with women? What's the motivation there, would you say?
Well, I think that raising children is probably the most deeply meaningful thing that human beings ever do. Carrying the race forward, putting your wisdom into, using your wisdom to shape a young life. I think that's the most deeply meaningful. And so I think that, the deepest need, in my view, that people have is for meaningful lives that they can say, that was worth doing. That was worthy of my being alive to do that. And so I think that that's what men get out of what they bring in service to women and to children and to families. They get that out of that. And that's why, that's why it's so dysfunctional what we're doing in family court, where we are relegating fathers to a kind of a visitor role, like every second weekend. We basically have taken the deep meaning of fatherhood, which is about having a responsible role in the shaping of a life. That's the joy of fatherhood, and we turn it into a role of duty, which is providing the money, and we steal most of the joy, and so it's deeply dysfunctional, the way that we have structured family court. We have essentially structured it under the Matrisensus to address women's needs, women's expressed desires, and overlooked men. Again, it comes back to we have empathy for the women, compassion without accountability for the women, and accountability without compassion for the men. Without compassion for fathers, you don't feel the need for the father to get something out of the relationship that makes sense for him. And so we just expect them to work and provide financial resources, and we steal the other part of that equation, which makes it worthwhile for them, why they do it, which is from the joys of parenthood.
That's fantastic. Yeah, because my family, My parents are very, very good. I've got a very good relationship with both my mum and dad. They are not together anymore, but they have a very I have a very good relationship with both of them. And and I think of it makes me think of like my relationship with my dad and how like lucky I am to have someone like that in my life. And because I've obviously the last several years I've been studying feminism from this anti-feminist lens. I've been looking at books like Is There Anything Good About Men? The Myth of Male Power, and really thinking more deeply about the concept of male duty and honor and sacrifice, because I think feminism has sold women this idea that men are pigs, they don't care about women, they only want sex. And it's really hard as a modern woman not to think like that. I think in this day and age, it's very hard to kind of not see men in a negative light, even if you don't mean it, because we're so bombarded with this all the time. And the behavior of women now, modern women, it's not really, because I don't believe that men are like like, I just look at people as people. I've had some very bad experiences with men and some very bad experiences with women, and I don't think that men are like somehow worse to like. I don't really view this framing of men as like oppressors or men as the bad guys. I don't think it has any merit to it. So I think there's a lot of toxicity in modern society now, and it feels like this has all been stirred up by feminism. This just hatred between the sexes. I think it's very sad. I think it's caused so many problems, and family breakdown and people not wanting to have children, and it's very, very sad. So I mean, when I talk to men like yourself, I kind of see that this isn't really true, and it does get me to kind of think, okay, maybe it's not what we may have internalized in the modern culture.
Yeah, what you're listing are some of the dysfunctions that are arising from Matrisensus, the feminine psychological pathology applied at the societal level. And there are many. It is a very dark system, and the prognosis is severe. We're doing great damage to our social structures, not least to the relationship between men and women, which is in a lot of trouble. Men have one of the key issues for men is that of honor. And the great mistake that feminists made was to dishonor men, was to say that men are dishonorable as a group, as a gender, because honor is one of the foundations of masculinity. And if honor isn't a foundation of masculinity, then we're in a very dark place. Because honor is expensive. Honor requires you to follow through. Honor requires you to be an adult. Honor requires you to do what you said you'd do, and to carry big loads. And so if we discredit honor, if we say to men, look, honor doesn't matter anymore, you're dishonorable no matter what you do, then we unleash all of the dark side. We basically destroy the main civilizing force that we apply to masculinity, to men in the world. And the end result of that is not good.
No, absolutely. That's very well said. Yeah. Wow, that's making me really think very seriously about certain things. So, I'd like to ask you something now. If matricensus is valid, is patriarchy also valid as a theory?
Yes, it's not valid in the way that feminists claim it, which is that they say there's nothing but patriarchy, that all masculine hierarchy is dysfunctional, is oppressive. That's not true. Jordan Peterson, for instance, he talks about the male competence hierarchy. And that's the term that I have used in the book to describe the healthy governmental structure that has been the pattern for the most part in the West. There have been various departures from that at various times and places, and certainly there are still individuals who depart from it. But the general pattern has been that government structures have been about service, have been about actually serving the communities that they govern. for the most part. And so that's the male competence hierarchy, and it's also the society archetype. It's what's built into us about how we should be in societies, how we should make societies work. Yeah, that does, people are people are human, and we all have flaws. And sometimes some individuals get into positions of power where they're not interested in service. They're only interested in personal power and personal wealth, and they corrupt everything. And we can call that patriarchy. I think that's a good name for it. I don't want to deny that there is a masculine social shadow. I don't want to deny that. If we can look at some African dictatorships, for instance, are very close to a patriarchal form of government for the whole country, where it's all about personal power and wealth and corruption, and not
or
about
even feminism.
So it does exist in the world, but we needed a name for the parallel feminine social shadow when female collective power goes wrong. And that's why I came up with the name Matrisensus. And it's important to realize that it takes a different form because it's a social consensus and not a hierarchy. Feminism has no person at the top. There's no CEO of feminism. There is no feminist social institution. There is no feminist corporation, right? It's not structured that way. And so it's a consensus. It operates at the level of social consensus, and everybody feels obliged to march in line. And we can see why, because, for instance, when university professors step out of line, you can see what happens to them. The social sanctions and the legal sanctions are severe. They can have their careers destroyed. And so that's the effect of a social consensus. It operates with a different form of coercion, but it's just as powerful.
That's really great stuff. I was actually going to ask you about Jordan Peterson, but I don't think it's necessary because you brought him up briefly. Because he talks a lot about competence. I'm a Peterson fan. I think he's great. I like what he says about hierarchies and competence. He talks a lot about archetypes. Would you say you're a fan of Peterson or?
Yes, I like Peterson very much. I think he's been a wonderful leader of the kind of the intellectual, healthy masculine to point to it and to recognize its value.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I was talking about my brother. He was like, "Yeah, no, he's great." A lot of men really like Peterson. I mean, I like him a lot. Some women like him too. So I would like to ask you, what do you think is the biggest challenge we are facing in tackling the problems caused by this matricensus, otherwise known as feminism?
Oh, I think the problem is huge. The one problem is getting a place to stand, because we all have this family archetype inside of us, and so it's a powerful thing. So having a place to stand where you can look at what's going on and be able to observe it from a distance and analyze it from a distance without being caught up in it is difficult. So the final two chapters in my book are about the second to last chapter is about personal healing. How do you get yourself to a place where you are personally empowered enough to be able to stand up and not get lost in the kind of social attacks that can come at you? And then the final chapter is about, and what can you actually do if you get to that place with the social institutions and with the culture? How do you proceed? It's not there's no one answer, but I think that the single answer is that we need to get ourselves to a place where we are free of polarization ourselves, where we are free of us and them thinking, and where we can look at the world as a parent looks at a child, which is, the world is in particular place. It's got lots of corruption and incompetences and lots of things, but they're just age appropriate, just like a 2-year-old child who can't yet tie their shoelaces. It's age appropriate. There's nothing wrong there. There's nothing that needs to be fixed. What you need to do is get down with that child and help them loop and cross their laces, help them learn how to do that task. It's a parental role that's needed in the world. So I recommend that we take the same stance to the world. There is nothing wrong in the world. The world is just socially immature. Everything that is. That's where we start. What's the next thing that needs to be done? How would a good parent look at the world and say, okay, how do I get down and work with these people in order to learn the next task? Not to judge what is, which only just leads to grievance, but to have a vision of where you want to go, and to have the humility to say, I'm going to get in with this and do what needs to be done. So that's how I personally try to approach this. That's why I wrote this book. The book is a diagnosis. It's not a judgment. It's not finger pointing. It's not saying this shouldn't have happened. It's not saying this is all wrong. It's a medical diagnosis. It's a psychological diagnosis. It says this is what we're facing, and here's how we can approach it as individuals to try to help it heal.
Okay. So yeah, a couple more things I'd like to ask before we start to round off. So, what was your favorite part of the book to write and research?
Oh, it was my chapter 11, which is the signs, the early signs of recovery.
Okay.
It's actually the longest chapter because there was so much that ended up going into there. There was a lot going on in the world that is very encouraging. That is quite surprising. I mean, let me talk about one thing that I discovered that was really exciting for me, and that is that YouTube stories, internet stories. There are thousands and thousands of YouTube stories that are about how to be healthy in relationships, how to be healthy in corporations, how to be healthy in families, how to be healthy in society. And they are stories about people, who encounter the kind of dysfunction that we typically see under Matrisensus, and how they deal with it, and the basic message is stand on principle, don't get into judgment, be clear about what you will and won't do, be clear about your reasons, don't react, don't get angry, be clear and consistent, and they're inspiring. I find myself listening to them regularly because, and that's a wonderful thing. It's a grassroots thing, like these. Go look at these stories. There's even male romance stories. We've never had male romance stories historically. Romance has always been
homosexual.
No, not sexual. Romance.
No, homosexual. I said.
No, these are heterosexual. These are heterosexual romance stories. These are men looking for wives and finding them in unlikely places. Now, you'll find that they're like men looking for wives in frontier settlements. So they're frontier stories. Or they're like, one of the strangest is alien romance stories. Type alien princess or alien woman into the YouTube search bar, and you will find hundreds of these stories. And they've got thousands of views. And they are about men finding romance with an alien woman. Now, at the surface level, rationally, this is absurd.
Sorry, when you say stories, is this something that they're actually experiencing, or is this fiction?
This is fiction. These are all fiction. They're audio stories, right? And they typically have a picture on the screen, right? It's created by AI or something. But what they are is they're stories. They're audio book stories that are typically about an hour long, and they're about men finding romance. This particular one is about men finding romance with alien women. Now, why alien women? Because men have given up on this culture, a lot of them, on finding romance with existing women in our contemporary culture. The stories are saying you have to go to aliens to find a good woman. So, this is sad, but it's also an indication of where the culture is at. So go look at some of these stories. They're fascinating. And they tell us a lot about what men are thinking. Young men, I think they're written for young men. And if you look at the comments, it's typically young men that are there listening to them. So anyway, this whole area was a great surprise when I stumbled across it. All of these thousands of YouTube stories about healthy male aspiration, healthy. When I say male, I mean masculine. These are the masculine energy, the standing on principle, holding boundaries, holding people to account.
Stoicism, right? That sounds more like stoicism.
Some of it, stoicism is in there, and so that's an encouraging sign. It's a resurgence of healthy masculine value system in the form of a story. And so these are saying to young men, this is how to be a good man. This is how to be honorable. And it's also hopeful because it means men haven't given up. They're still saying these good masculine principles matter. They're important. Don't give them up just because they've been trashed in contemporary society. And so, that whole thing was a wonderful discovery for me. Writing that chapter about the early signs of recovery from Matrisensus was exciting for me.
That's fantastic. Yeah, and I actually thought, he's not a storyteller, but he is a YouTuber. His name is Cole Hastings. He's got quite a big channel, and he's about my age. He's American, and I really like because he talks a lot about self-improvement and fitness, masculinity, but he mainly talks about relationships and self-improvement. And I love his channel. His content has helped me so much, and I love listening to him because he really talks a lot about it's not this kind of cookie cutter stuff which is just how to improve your life. It's very grounded, and he has his own personal take on things, and he's very anecdotal. He talks about his own experiences, his own difficult relationships and failures in relationships with women. And for me, it's very fascinating to hear this because it makes me think, and I just find it very comforting. But yeah, no, that's great stuff. So final thing I'd like to ask you is, would you consider yourself an MRA, as in a men's rights activist?
I used to. I kind of don't now, and it's not because I've turned away from that. It's because I'm really not active as an advocate in that way anymore. What I have become is more of a cultural analyst. I think that what I can, my gift to the world is this diagnosis, and that's where I want to focus my energy. So I see myself as an analyst, not an advocate. But certainly, I advocate for men when I'm in that environment. I recognize the ways that that men's issues are legitimate. My first book was called "The Hand That Rocks the World," and it was about
how that rocks the cradle. I was getting confused.
Yeah, well, "The Hand That Rocks the World" is it's a reference to the hand that rocks the cradle.
Yeah,
the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. And so this was a book about female power and about men's issues. And my second book was Daughters of Feminism, and that was stories by women about how they discovered the legitimacy of men's issues. And so that was an advocacy book. And I plan to put out a volume 2 of that book in the future. And so, so there's still a part of me that's an advocate for men, a men's rights advocate. But I don't even like the men's rights advocate. I don't like the rights part. I think of myself as a men's issues
Okay.
advocate. But again, my greater focus these days is on providing the diagnostic analysis of what's going on in the culture, because I think that that's the really important piece. Advocacy hasn't moved things very much over 60 years. Uh,
Mm.
and so my great research project was to understand why that is, and that's what this book, Matrisensus, basically outlines, is why it is that identity politics is so powerful, and why advocacy is probably not going to make much headway against it, and what we need to do.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, no, we're all about cultural analysis on this channel, and for those who are listening or watching, I don't identify as an MRA. I'm not a men's rights activist. The best label I would give myself is an egalitarian or anti-feminist egalitarian. But yeah, thank you so much, David. It's been honestly wonderful, and please, everybody, go check out his book. Like, this is fantastic. So yeah, Matrisensus, I love that word. And it's been a pleasure to have you on the channel. So my next live stream will be with Professor Janice Fiamengo, who actually wrote the foreword of this book. And she's a lovely woman and a friend of mine. So looking forward to having her on the podcast. This is The Rational Female tuning out. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you